The air was thick with anticipation as Alexander Whitmore stepped into the modest community hall, newly refurbished and brightly lit for the orphanage's opening. Though the setting was humble, the event was grand, with local officials and philanthropists filling the small room with chatter and ceremony. Alexander was known for his stoic demeanor, a man in his late 50s with a reserved expression that rarely softened. Yet tonight, a faint smile crept onto his face, a rare display of warmth that matched the light in his steel-blue eyes as he mingled and listened to speeches. He was drawn to this event by a call to give back, a small attempt at easing the nagging sense of something unresolved. In the middle of a conversation, however, his attention was abruptly captured by a single, crystal-clear voice from across the hall. He turned instinctively, catching sight of a girl no older than 8, with tousled dark hair and a look of fierce curiosity. She was surrounded by a group of children, her tiny frame somehow standing out as she animatedly spoke, her expressive eyes darting with an unusual intensity. But it wasn't her appearance that arrested him. It was the words she uttered, words he thought he'd never hear again. "But you know," the girl said, almost defiantly, "sometimes you just have to see beyond the fog. That's how you find the truth." The voice was small, innocent, yet hauntingly familiar. Alexander's body stiffened, his breath catching. It was a phrase only one other person had ever said to him. His daughter, Sarah. She had spoken those exact words just days before everything changed forever. "What did you say?" he found himself whispering, though she was much too far to hear. Still, his gaze didn't falter. As if sensing his attention, the girl looked up, her eyes locking onto his with a curiosity that mirrored his own. A slight frown creased her forehead as she noticed him staring, and for a moment, the noise around him seemed to fade. The resemblance between this girl and the memory of his daughter as a child struck him harder than he expected. The words, the look in her eyes. Was it just a coincidence? Unable to let it go, Alexander made his way toward her, ignoring the calls of colleagues and acquaintances around him. His steps were slow, measured, as he tried to mask the sudden surge of emotions flooding his chest. The girl noticed him approaching and tilted her head, a look of slight mistrust flashing across her face. "Hello there," he greeted, crouching slightly to meet her at eye level. "What's your name?" She took a cautious step back, gripping a small pendant around her neck as she scrutinized him. "Mia," she replied, her voice quiet and defensive. "I'm Alexander. I heard you talking just now about seeing beyond the fog." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "That's a rather thoughtful thing to say for someone your age." Mia's brow furrowed, and she took another step back, her tiny hand still clutching the pendant. "My mom used to say that," she answered, glancing around as if she wanted an escape route. Alexander felt a pang as he noticed her reluctance, the shield she'd put up instantly at his approach. "I didn't mean to startle you. It's just, my daughter used to say the same thing," he explained, feeling the weight of his own voice soften as he spoke. "You remind me of her." She looked at him then, her gaze less guarded and more puzzled, as if trying to make sense of the man standing before her. She opened her mouth to say something but stopped, the words slipping away as quickly as they'd come. At that moment, one of the orphanage's attendants approached, placing a hand on Mia's shoulder with a gentle smile. "Is everything all right, Mia?" she asked, looking between the two of them. Mia nodded, breaking her gaze from Alexander. She glanced up one last time, her expression unreadable, before slipping away with the attendant, disappearing back into the gathering crowd. Alexander remained rooted to the spot, his eyes following her until she was completely out of sight. For the first time in years, he felt something stir, a restlessness, an urgent curiosity. Alexander lingered at the edge of the crowded room, his eyes still drawn to the spot where Mia had stood moments before. Her voice, the words she had said, and that glint of curiosity in her gaze played over and over in his mind. He barely noticed when one of the orphanage staff approached, congratulating him on the event's success. He forced a polite smile, nodding, but his attention was far from the conversation. Later, after the speeches were over and guests began to thin out, Alexander drifted through the orphanage hallways, his gaze scanning the rooms, each filled with small beds and shelves cluttered with worn-out toys. He searched for her without really understanding why. He found himself in a room at the end of the corridor, dimly lit by a small window. There, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a worn picture book in her lap, was Mia. Alexander's footsteps were soft, hesitant as he entered the room. She looked up and stared at him, her expression unreadable but guarded, as if she had already prepared herself for his questions. "Hi, Mia," he began softly, hoping his voice sounded reassuring. "Do you mind if I sit with you?" She glanced at the empty space on the floor beside her, then gave a slight nod. He eased down slowly, aware that the last thing he wanted was to make her feel pressured or uncomfortable. "You like reading?" he asked, gesturing to the book she held. "Sometimes," she replied, her voice barely audible. "The pictures help me think about other places." He watched her face closely, noting the slight shadows under her eyes, the way she clutched the book as if it were an anchor. "What kind of places do you like to think about?" She hesitated before answering, her gaze falling back to the book. "I don't know. Somewhere quiet, safe, maybe. It gets noisy here sometimes." Her response was simple, but something about it weighed heavily on Alexander. "You know, when my daughter was young, she used to imagine places like that too. She even used to draw them. Fields with wildflowers, peaceful rivers. She'd get lost in her drawings." Mia's face softened a little, but she quickly looked away, focusing on her fingers tracing the edges of the book cover. "Maybe your daughter and I would have been friends then." The words hit Alexander harder than he anticipated. He had no idea if Mia could understand how much her comments stirred his heart. For a brief moment, he could almost see his daughter, Sarah, sitting there instead, eyes bright with dreams of distant places. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his composure. "How long have you been here, Mia?" 2 years, I think," she replied, glancing out the window. "But I'm not really sure." "And before that?" Her gaze shifted uneasily, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "I lived with my mom," she said quietly, "but she got sick. After that, well, I ended up here." Alexander swallowed the tightness forming in his throat, struggling to hold back questions he knew would seem too forward. Instead, he nodded, trying to offer some comfort in his silence. But then, he noticed something glinting around her neck. It was a small pendant on a worn silver chain, catching the faint light from the window. His heart skipped as he recognized the delicate floral engraving on its surface. The pendant was unmistakable. He'd had it custom-made for his daughter years ago. Mia noticed him staring, and her fingers immediately flew to the pendant, gripping it protectively. "Why are you looking at my necklace?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. "That pendant," he stammered, his voice faltering. "It looks just like one I once gave my daughter. She wore it all the time." Mia's face softened slightly. She relaxed her grip on the pendant and looked down at it, running her thumb over its surface. "My mom gave it to me. She said it would remind me of her if I ever felt lonely." Her voice held a trace of warmth, the memory pulling her away from the present. The room fell silent, but Alexander could feel the questions welling up, nearly spilling over. How could it be the same pendant? How did this girl know that phrase? It was too much of a coincidence. He felt like he was on the edge of uncovering something important, something buried beneath the surface of his own painful past. "Do you ever remember things about your mom?" he asked gently, not wanting to push but unable to stop himself. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the pendant once more. "Just little things. Things she used to say or do." She paused, glancing at him with a slight frown. "Why are you asking so many questions?" "I'm sorry," he said, backing off, realizing how inquisitive he must seem. "It's just, you remind me of someone very dear to me." Mia looked away, and the guarded expression returned, her walls rising back up. She stood abruptly, clutching the book to her chest. "I have to go," she murmured, her tone final. Alexander watched as she turned and hurried out of the room, leaving him alone with a sense of confusion and wonder. This was no ordinary encounter, he was sure of it. And as he sat in the dim light, he knew one thing. He couldn't leave it at this. The following morning, Alexander found himself sitting in his office, his mind far from the mountain of paperwork piled in front of him. The encounter with Mia replayed in his thoughts, vivid and unsettling. Her words, her expressions, the pendant. It was all too strange to dismiss as mere coincidence. The image of Mia clutching that pendant with such reverence haunted him, stirring memories he had tried to bury for years. He reached for his phone, dialing the orphanage's number with a sense of urgency he barely understood. A woman answered, her voice brisk and cheerful. "Good morning, St. Mary's Orphanage. How may I assist you?" "Yes, good morning," Alexander replied, trying to steady his voice. "This is Alexander Whitmore. I was there yesterday for the inauguration, and I wanted to inquire about a girl I met, Mia." The woman's voice brightened. "Ah, yes, Mr. Whitmore. It was wonderful having you with us yesterday." "Mia, you say?" "Yes, she's a special little girl. Quiet, but very bright." "Yes, that's the one," he said, almost impatiently. "I'd like to know if there's any information on her family, anything at all?" The woman hesitated, and he could sense her wariness. "I'm afraid our records are confidential, Mr. Whitmore. We can't release information about the children, not without official permissions or a direct familial connection." Alexander's heart sank, but he managed a polite response. "Of course, I understand. I felt a connection, I suppose." He stopped himself, feeling foolish for admitting such a thing to a stranger. After a brief, uncomfortable pause, the woman's voice softened. "I can tell you this much. Mia was placed with us about 2 years ago after her mother's passing. We don't have any contact information for other family members. She hasn't had a visitor in all this time, so she's a bit withdrawn." Alexander felt a pang of sadness hearing this, yet a strange hope bloomed within him. She could indeed be connected to Sarah, somehow. Her age, her mannerisms, even that pendant. The clues were leading him somewhere, and he couldn't ignore it. "Thank you, that's helpful," he replied finally, a plan forming in his mind. "I'd like to visit her, if that's allowed. Perhaps spend some time with her?" "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Mia hasn't had many personal visits, so I think she might appreciate that," she replied kindly. "Shall we say tomorrow afternoon?" "Yes, tomorrow," he answered, his voice filled with determination. The next day, Alexander arrived at the orphanage just as the sun began dipping behind the city skyline, casting a soft glow over the building. He felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation as he stepped through the doors, greeted by the same woman from before, who led him down the now familiar corridors. "Wait here, I'll go get her," she said, leaving him in a small, cozy room filled with children's books and a few worn armchairs. Moments later, Mia entered, her expression a mix of curiosity and reluctance. She glanced around the room as if deciding whether it was safe before her gaze settled on Alexander. "Hello, Mia," he said, his tone gentle. "Thank you for meeting me again." She nodded slightly, then took a seat across from him, her eyes studying him with a quiet intensity that seemed far beyond her years. They sat in silence for a few moments, each assessing the other. Alexander noticed that, once again, she was clutching the pendant, as if drawing strength from it. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he began carefully, watching for her reaction. "About your mom giving you that pendant. My daughter had one just like it. So much like it, in fact, that it's hard to believe there's another like it in the world." Mia frowned, her fingers still toying with the pendant. "My mom said it was special. She wore it all the time," she said softly. "She told me to keep it safe." Alexander's heart thudded painfully at her words. The more she spoke, the more he felt Sarah's presence in this room. There was something there, something he was missing. He just had to keep pressing. "Do you remember anything else about her?" he asked gently. "Anything she might have said about her family?" Mia's face clouded, and she looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "Sometimes, she talked about someone she loved but couldn't be with. She always looked sad when she said that." Alexander took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling over him. This only added to his conviction. He had no doubt now that Sarah must have had a child, a hidden piece of her life he'd never known. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Mia, would you like to come with me for a walk? Just around the block?" I know this might sound strange, but I'd like to show you some places my daughter used to love. She looked at him, curiosity mingling with a trace of hesitation. But then she nodded, something in his face perhaps convincing her to trust him. Outside, the evening air was cool and fresh, and they walked quietly through the narrow streets around the orphanage. Alexander pointed out small details, stories about places he used to visit with Sarah, an old bookstore, a park bench they'd always sit on. Mia listened, her expression thoughtful, as though she could picture the scenes he described. After a few minutes, she stopped, looking up at him. You miss her a lot, don't you? Alexander's throat tightened, and he managed a slight nod. Every day. She was everything to me. Mia didn't say anything more, but he could see a flicker of understanding in her eyes. They continued walking in silence, each lost in thought. Finally, they made their way back to the orphanage, where Mia turned to face him just outside the doors. I don't remember much about my mom, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I think she would have liked you. Alexander's heart swelled at her words, and he reached out, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. Thank you, Mia. That means a lot. As she stepped back inside, disappearing into the shadows of the orphanage, Alexander knew he couldn't leave her future up to chance. Whatever it took, he was going to find out the truth. Over the following days, Alexander found himself preoccupied, thoughts of Mia filling every quiet moment. She had unknowingly opened a door to a past he hadn't dared revisit in years, and now he couldn't ignore the possibility tugging at him. That Mia might be connected to his daughter, Sarah. He knew he needed more than hunches and instinct. He needed proof. One evening, Alexander sat in his study, surrounded by photo albums and stacks of Sarah's old belongings. He ran his hand over a small, leather-bound journal with delicate gold lettering on the cover, a gift he had given her on her 18th birthday. She had filled it with sketches, quotes, and bits of poetry she loved. As he leafed through the pages, he found himself drawn to the last entry she had made, shortly before her tragic passing. Her words were cryptic, vague allusions to something troubling her that she hadn't been able to share openly. One entry in particular caught his eye. Sometimes I feel like there's a piece of me hidden in plain sight, a part one don't know how to protect, but I'm doing what I can, even if it means keeping secrets. Alexander frowned, tracing her handwriting with his finger, feeling the mystery of her words echo through him. Sarah had been fiercely independent, and though they'd had a close bond, he'd always sensed there were parts of her life she kept hidden, even from him. In the days that followed, Alexander's determination only grew. He contacted an old friend, David, a retired private investigator he trusted. When David answered the phone, his voice was warm and familiar. Alexander, it's been a while. What can I do for you? David, Alexander began, his tone serious. I have a personal favor to ask. He hesitated before adding, I met someone recently, a little girl named Mia. She reminds me so much of Sarah that it's unsettling. I need your help looking into her background. I have to know if she might be connected. David paused on the other end, sensing the weight behind Alexander's request. Of course, Alex. I'll see what I can dig up. Just send me whatever details you have. Within hours, Alexander sent David everything he knew, which wasn't much, just her name, Mia, her estimated age, and the location of the orphanage. It felt like little more than a shot in the dark, but he trusted David's skill. He'd need time, of course, and Alexander could only wait, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. Several days later, Alexander found himself once again at the orphanage. This time, however, he came with a small gift for Mia, a bouquet of wildflowers, a mix of delicate blues and purples, just like the ones Sarah used to pick in the spring. As he approached the orphanage entrance, he felt a strange mixture of hope and trepidation, almost as if this visit could bring him closer to the truth. Inside, he found Mia sitting alone at a table, working intently on a drawing. She looked up as he approached, her eyes brightening just slightly when she saw him. Hi, Mia, he greeted warmly. I brought you something. He handed her the flowers, and she looked at them, an expression of surprise crossing her face. She touched the petals delicately, almost reverently. These are Really pretty, she said softly. Thank you. You're welcome, Alexander replied, watching as she set the bouquet down beside her drawing. What are you working on? Mia hesitated, glancing down at the sketch before turning it toward him. It was a picture of a meadow, with tall grass swaying under a bright, open sky. There was a small figure in the distance, surrounded by flowers. I dream about this place sometimes, she murmured, as if confessing a secret. I don't know where it is, but it feels familiar. Alexander's heart tightened. He recognized the scene immediately. It was remarkably similar to the place Sarah used to visit on her quiet weekends, a small meadow on the outskirts of town. He remembered taking her there when she was young, letting her wander and collect wildflowers while he sat nearby, watching her explore with an unguarded joy that seemed so rare in their lives. The familiarity of Mia's drawing sent a chill through him. Mia, he began slowly, choosing his words with care. This place. It looks like somewhere my daughter used to go. Maybe one day, I could take you there if you'd like. She looked up at him, her expression cautious but intrigued. Maybe, she said quietly, a hint of longing in her eyes. Just then, the orphanage's administrator appeared in the doorway, catching Alexander's attention. She beckoned him over, and he excused himself, giving Mia a small smile before stepping aside. Mr. Whitmore, the woman began, lowering her voice. There was something in Mia's file I thought you might want to know. She glanced back toward Mia, who was now absorbed in her drawing again. She had a mother listed, but no other family information was ever provided. No father, no extended family. But there was one item Mia had with her when she arrived, something she never lets out of her sight. Alexander's pulse quickened, his thoughts racing. The pendant? The administrator nodded. Yes. It's strange, really. I remember when she first came here. She was so protective of it. She clung to it like it was her only connection to her past. A knot formed in Alexander's chest, tightening with each word. It all felt too real, too connected to be a coincidence. He turned back to look at Mia, who was now carefully placing the flowers he had given her in an empty cup on the table. She caught his gaze and offered a small, hesitant smile, one that made his heart ache with both hope and dread. Thank you, he told the administrator quietly, his voice thick. I appreciate you sharing that with me. As he left the orphanage that day, Alexander felt the weight of the mystery surrounding Mia growing heavier, yet somehow more defined. He knew now that he had to confront his own past, to dig deeper into the secrets Sarah had taken with her. Whatever it took, he was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing parts of his daughter's life he'd never known. The next morning, Alexander received a call from David, his old friend and investigator. His voice was calm, but Alexander detected an undertone of curiosity. Alexander, I've been able to gather some preliminary information, David began. You were right. There's something unusual about this girl's history. Can we meet in person to discuss it? They agreed to meet at Alexander's favorite cafe, a quiet spot tucked away on a narrow street where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the hum of conversation. Alexander arrived early, his mind whirring with possibilities, his gaze drifting toward the door every few seconds. When David finally walked in, Alexander's chest tightened with anticipation. David's face was serious, his usual easygoing smile absent. They greeted each other with a brief handshake before settling into a quiet corner. Alexander leaned forward, barely able to contain his urgency. So, what did you find? David pulled out a folder, thick with papers, and placed it on the table between them. The information on Mia was harder to find than I expected, he admitted. There's almost nothing in the usual records, which suggests someone might have intentionally left it that way. Alexander's brow furrowed. What do you mean? David flipped open the folder, revealing documents and notes he had scribbled in his precise handwriting. Mia was registered at the orphanage 2 years ago, like you said, but there's no record of her mother. No hospital records, no birth certificate in the usual databases. It's as if she doesn't exist on paper. Alexander's heart pounded as he took in David's words, but he struggled to process the implications. But that doesn't make sense. There has to be something. There was one small detail that stood out, though, David continued, tapping a page near the top of the stack. It's this signature here on her admission form. He pointed to a faint signature at the bottom of the page, a hurried scrawl, yet unmistakable in its shape. I recognized it immediately. It's Sarah's signature. Alexander felt as though the room had tilted. The signature, so familiar yet jarring in this context, seemed to blur before his eyes as he struggled to focus. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. David nodded, watching him closely. "I'd recognize it anywhere. It's as if Sarah personally placed her in the orphanage, but didn't want anyone to know." A heavy silence fell between them. Alexander could feel his pulse racing, the realization both exhilarating and painful. If Sarah signed that form, then Mia might be. She might actually be her daughter. David finished for him, his voice low. "It's highly likely." Alexander leaned back, a hand pressed to his forehead as he tried to absorb the enormity of it. He had been so close to the truth, yet so far. His own daughter had had a child, a granddaughter he had never known existed until now. Why would she hide it? Alexander murmured, more to himself than to David. "Why wouldn't she tell me?" David's expression softened with sympathy. Maybe she was afraid. Maybe she felt she couldn't tell anyone, especially you. The Whitmore name comes with expectations, after all. She may have wanted to protect her child from that. Alexander thought back to Sarah's last months, the subtle distance he had sensed but hadn't questioned, thinking it was only the natural distance that sometimes grew between parents and their adult children. But perhaps it had been more than that. Perhaps she had been carrying this burden alone, fearing judgment, maybe even rejection. "What do I do now?" Alexander asked, his voice filled with an uncharacteristic vulnerability. David gave a small, understanding smile. "If you want my advice, Alexander, you find a way to be there for that little girl. She's family, after all. And from the sounds of it, she could use someone who cares." Alexander nodded, the weight of David's words grounding him. After all these years, he had a chance to make up for lost time. A chance to be a part of Mia's life, if she'd allow it. He thanked David, and they parted with a mutual understanding that this was just the beginning. That evening, Alexander found himself at his desk, pen in hand, as he carefully wrote a letter to the orphanage administrator. He explained his intent, requesting permission to spend more time with Mia and to explore the possibility of becoming her guardian. It was a formal letter, but one that carried his genuine resolve to finally bring the past into the open, to accept whatever came of it. Days passed with anxious waiting until, at last, he received a response. The administrator agreed to meet him in person to discuss the process and potential options. Alexander felt a surge of relief, but knew that even with this approval, he was only beginning to peel back the layers of a hidden family legacy. When he arrived at the orphanage for the meeting, Mia was there, waiting in the hallway, her small frame barely filling the large chair she sat on. She looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity when she saw him approach. "Hi, Mia," he greeted warmly, his voice carrying a gentleness he hadn't realized he could muster. "Hi," she replied, a shy smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. He sat down beside her, feeling the familiar tug of affection. "I wanted to tell you, I'm going to be around more often. I'd like to spend more time with you, if that's all right." Her smile widened slightly, and she looked down, her fingers brushing over the pendant around her neck. "I think I'd like that." In that moment, Alexander felt a deep sense of belonging he hadn't known in years, a quiet but powerful connection that filled the silence between them. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it, for himself, for Sarah's memory, and for Mia. He had found his family again, even if it had come through an unexpected and difficult path, and he knew, without a doubt, that he would protect and cherish it with all that he had. On a chilly Saturday morning, Alexander waited at the orphanage entrance, feeling both nervous and hopeful. Today was the first time he'd been granted permission to take Mia out for the entire day, an opportunity he had worked toward since that last conversation with the administrator. This wasn't just a visit. It was a step forward, a step toward finally giving Mia a place in his life. The door opened and Mia appeared, bundled in a worn but neatly buttoned coat, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. She gave a small, tentative wave, and Alexander felt a surge of warmth as he waved back, stepping forward to greet her. "Good morning, Mia," he said, smiling as he crouched down to her level. "I thought we'd start with breakfast. How does that sound?" She nodded, her face brightening. "What kind of breakfast?" "Oh, well, I was thinking of a big one. Pancakes, maybe?" he suggested, recalling how much Sarah had loved them as a child. Mia's eyes sparkled, and she nodded enthusiastically. "I like pancakes." They walked side by side toward the small cafe Alexander had chosen, a cozy spot with big windows that offered a view of the bustling city street. Mia seemed at ease, her small hand slipping into his as they crossed the busy intersections. For Alexander, that simple gesture was everything. He felt a closeness, a silent promise of trust that filled him with a mixture of joy and longing. Inside the cafe, they found a table by the window, and soon the waitress brought a plate piled with fluffy pancakes, topped with whipped cream and a handful of strawberries. Mia's face lit up with delight as she dug in, savoring each bite with childlike enthusiasm. Alexander watched her, a soft smile tugging at his lips as he sipped his coffee. "So, Mia, what do you like to do when you're not at school?" he asked gently, wanting to know more about the small details of her life. She looked up, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "I like drawing and reading," she said between bites. "Sometimes I pretend I'm in a big castle or a forest." Her answer took him by surprise, reminding him of Sarah's vivid imagination. "A castle? That sounds interesting. And who would you be in the castle?" She tilted her head, pondering his question. "I'd be someone with lots of friends and animals. Like a queen, but a nice one," she added with a grin. Alexander chuckled softly. "A kind queen, huh? I can see that." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "You know, Mia, if you'd like, I could take you to a place with lots of trees, somewhere you can pretend you're in a forest. Would you like that?" She nodded, her eyes wide with excitement, and they finished their breakfast quickly, Mia's eagerness infectious. Alexander guided her to his car, and they drove toward a nearby nature reserve, a place with towering trees and winding trails he used to visit with Sarah when she was Mia's age. As they walked through the forest, Mia ran her fingers along the rough bark of the trees, her small footprints mixing with Alexander's in the soft earth. She moved slowly, observing every detail, lost in her own world. Occasionally, she would pause to examine a pine cone or to listen to the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. "This place is so big," she said, looking up at the sky through a break in the trees. "It feels like there's no end." "It does, doesn't it?" Alexander replied, walking beside her. "When my daughter was young, she used to run around here, saying the same thing. She thought the forest went on forever." Mia glanced at him, her face curious. "You talk about her a lot," she said quietly. "Did you love her very much?" Alexander stopped walking, taken aback by the question's simplicity and the depth behind it. He looked down at Mia, searching for the right words. "Yes," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than anything in the world." Mia nodded, as if she already understood, and a thoughtful silence settled over them. After a moment, she tugged at his hand, signaling that she wanted to keep walking. They strolled together, the quiet punctuated only by the sounds of the forest, each step grounding Alexander in the present while reminding him of his past. As they returned to the car, Mia seemed different, more at ease, her usual guarded expression softened. She climbed into the back seat, clutching a small acorn she'd picked up along the trail, as though it were a precious treasure. On the drive back to the city, she spoke up suddenly. "Would it be okay if I kept this?" she asked, showing him the acorn. "To remember today?" Alexander smiled, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Of course, Mia. It's yours to keep." He dropped her off at the orphanage in the late afternoon, but as he turned to leave, Mia surprised him by reaching out and giving him a quick hug, her small arms wrapping around his waist. He froze, taken aback, then gently returned the hug, his heart swelling with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she whispered before quickly pulling away, her face flushed. "I had a good time." Alexander knelt down, meeting her gaze. "I had a good time too, Mia. And you don't have to call me Mr. Whitmore. You can call me Alexander." He paused, his heart beating faster as he added, "Or Grandpa, if you'd like." Mia's eyes widened, and for a moment, he wondered if he'd overstepped. But then she smiled shyly, nodding slightly. "Okay, Grandpa." As he left the orphanage that evening, Alexander felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. Mia was no longer just a possibility, a question mark in his life. She was real, and she was family. He had taken the first true steps toward a bond that he hoped would only deepen with time. And for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt a glimmer of peace, a quiet certainty that he was right where he belonged. A few weeks passed, and Alexander's visits with Mia became routine. Every Saturday, he would pick her up from the orphanage, and they would spend the day together, exploring new places around the city or simply enjoying quiet afternoons in the park. They developed an easy rhythm, and with each passing day, he felt her warming to him, her laughter growing more frequent, her smiles more open. One afternoon, after a particularly long day spent wandering the art district, Alexander noticed Mia clutching her pendant more than usual. She had a distant look in her eyes, one he recognized as the kind of look Sarah had whenever she was struggling to make sense of her thoughts. He waited until they were seated in a quiet corner of a small cafe, sipping hot chocolate, before gently bringing it up. "Mia," he began, his voice soft, "I've noticed that you seem to hold on to that pendant a lot. Does it help you remember your mom?" She nodded, gazing down at the small, silver pendant as she turned it slowly between her fingers. "Sometimes it does," she admitted. "When I feel alone, it reminds me of her." Alexander felt a pang in his chest. "I know how much you must miss her." Mia was quiet, then looked up at him with a vulnerability that took him by surprise. "Did you ever miss Sarah like that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Every day," he answered honestly, the words coming easier than he expected. "I still do. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about her." Mia nodded, seeming to take in his words, then returned her focus to the pendant, tracing the engraved pattern. She must have been a good person," she said softly. "I think my mom would have liked her." Alexander's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Your mom must have been a good person too, Mia. I think she and Sarah would have been very good friends." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in thoughts of the people they had lost. Eventually, Mia spoke again, her tone hesitant. Do you think I'll forget her someday?" "No, sweetheart," Alexander replied, leaning forward. "You'll carry her with you in everything you do. She'll always be a part of you." She nodded, seemingly reassured, and a small smile crept onto her face. "I think I'll remember her better with you here." Alexander reached across the table, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. He was about to respond when his phone vibrated in his pocket. Excusing himself, he glanced at the screen and saw it was a message from David. He opened it, reading quickly. The message was brief. "We need to talk. There's something more you need to know about Mia's mother." Alexander's chest tightened. He had asked David to help him uncover any other details he could find about Mia's family, and now it seemed there was another piece of the puzzle he had yet to discover. He glanced back at Mia, who was happily finishing her hot chocolate, and forced himself to push the message aside. Whatever it was, it could wait. For now, his focus was on her. They finished their outing with a walk by the river, where Mia tossed small pebbles into the water, watching the ripples spread out across the surface. Her laughter echoed over the quiet, reflecting his own growing sense of hope. But in the back of his mind, the words of David's message lingered, and he knew he would need to face whatever truths were waiting. The following evening, Alexander called David, arranging to meet him at his home. When David arrived, he looked serious, a set of papers tucked under his arm. Alexander ushered him into the study, pouring them both a glass of whiskey, bracing himself for what he knew could be a difficult conversation. David set the papers on the desk, looking at Alexander with a gravity that made Alexander's pulse quicken. "What is it, David? What did you find?" David hesitated, his eyes searching Alexander's face as if gauging how much to reveal. "There's something you need to know about Mia's mother," he began slowly. "I dug a little deeper, and I found some medical records from the last few months of Sarah's life. It turns out she was in and out of the hospital for a condition she'd kept hidden from everyone, even you. Alexander's jaw tightened. A condition? What kind of condition? David slid a medical report across the table. She was pregnant when she first came to the hospital, but there were complications, and it appears that Mia's birth was a difficult one. It's likely Sarah knew she wouldn't survive long after. The revelation hit Alexander like a blow. He could barely breathe as the truth settled over him. Sarah had known. She had known she wouldn't live to raise her daughter, and yet she'd chosen to keep that secret, facing it alone. And she still didn't tell me, Alexander whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She didn't even say goodbye. David placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. I think she wanted to spare you, Alexander. She was trying to protect you in her own way. Alexander clenched his fists, a flood of emotions overwhelming him. Anger, sadness, regret. They all twisted together, tearing through him as he tried to make sense of it. Sarah, his beloved daughter, had borne all of this alone. And yet, even in her silence, she had given him a gift he could now hold on to, a chance to love her daughter, to offer Mia the family Sarah never had the courage to ask for herself. After David left, Alexander sat alone in his study, staring at the papers David had left behind. A strange calm settled over him as he read through them, each word a reminder of Sarah's sacrifice and strength. She had chosen this path, had left behind a legacy he could now protect. With renewed determination, he decided to move forward with formal adoption proceedings. He wanted Mia to be safe, to be with him, not as a temporary guardian, but as her family. A few days later, Alexander sat down with Mia in the orphanage's garden, the evening sunlight casting warm shadows over the two of them. She looked up at him with her wide, curious eyes, as if sensing he had something important to say. Mia, he began softly, I wanted to ask you something. I've spoken with the people here at the orphanage, and, well, I'd like you to come live with me. For good. Not just for visits. Mia blinked, her face a mix of surprise and confusion. You mean, like a real home? Yes, he replied, his voice filled with gentle assurance. A real home. I'd be there every day. You'd have your own room, and we could make it just the way you like. She was quiet for a moment, looking down at her hands as she processed his words. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, but a smile spread across her face, small and shy. I think I'd like that, Grandpa. He gathered her into his arms, holding her close, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. He had found his way back to family, to a future he could cherish, to the memory of Sarah that would live on in Mia's laughter, her dreams, her strength. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt whole. On the day Mia moved into Alexander's home, the air was filled with the crisp scent of autumn. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot as Alexander helped her carry her few belongings into the large house that had once felt too empty, too silent. Now, it echoed with a quiet energy, a new sense of purpose that Alexander hadn't felt in years. Mia stepped inside cautiously, looking around the spacious entryway with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She clutched a small bag to her chest, her eyes wide as they took in the polished floors, the grand staircase, and the light filtering through the tall windows. Alexander placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, giving her an encouraging smile. Welcome home, Mia, he said softly, feeling the words settle warmly between them. She looked up at him, a small smile breaking through her shyness. It's so big, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. He chuckled, leading her further inside. It might feel big now, but soon enough, it'll feel just right. He guided her upstairs to her new room, a cozy space he had spent days preparing. The walls were painted a soft lavender, and the bed was covered with a colorful quilt that he thought she might like. Bookshelves lined one wall, already stocked with a few storybooks he had picked out, and a small desk sat by the window, overlooking the garden. Mia stood in the doorway, staring at it all with wide eyes, her fingers fiddling with the strap of her bag. Is this all for me? She asked, glancing back at him, as if afraid the room might disappear if she looked away. Yes, it is, he replied, his voice filled with quiet pride. Your space. You can add anything you like. Make it yours." She nodded slowly, stepping inside with a cautious reverence, running her hand over the quilt on the bed and trailing her fingers along the spines of the books on the shelves. She opened her bag, carefully placing her cherished pendant and the small acorn she had picked up from the forest onto the nightstand, her treasures arranged with deliberate care. Alexander watched her with a mix of tenderness and sadness, seeing how carefully she handled even the smallest objects. It was as though she was unused to having anything that truly belonged to her, and his heart ached at the thought. Once she'd settled in, he led her downstairs to the kitchen, where he prepared a simple dinner: spaghetti with a side of garlic bread, one of Sarah's favorites when she was young. They sat at the table, and he watched her eat with quiet enjoyment, noticing how she seemed to savor every bite. Between mouthfuls, Mia looked up, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Did my mom used to live here too?" Alexander nodded, feeling the familiar pang of loss but finding comfort in Mia's interest. "Yes, she did. I used to read her stories every night, right there in the room you're in now." She tilted her head, intrigued. "What kind of stories?" "Oh, all kinds," he replied with a soft smile. "Fairy tales, adventures." She loved anything with a brave hero or magical places. Mia's eyes lit up. "I love stories like that too," she said excitedly. Maybe you could read me some?" The request caught him by surprise, but he nodded immediately, touched by her openness. "Of course, I'd be honored." After dinner, they went up to her room, where she had already picked out a book from the shelf, clutching it to her chest as she climbed into bed. Alexander sat beside her, opening to the first page, and began reading. His voice softened as he read each line, his heart full as he watched Mia's expression shift with each twist and turn of the story. He felt Sarah's presence more keenly than ever, almost as though she were there, listening along with them. When he finished, Mia blinked sleepily, her small hand still holding the edge of the quilt. She looked up at him, her voice drowsy but grateful. "Thank you, Grandpa." The simple words filled him with a quiet joy, and he leaned down to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. "Good night, Mia." Over the weeks that followed, they fell into a comforting routine. Alexander would make breakfast for them each morning, and they'd sit by the window, watching as the trees outside turned from vibrant red and orange to bare branches against the winter sky. They spent weekends exploring the local library, where Mia would eagerly pick out books, stacking them carefully in her arms as if they were treasures. One evening, as they were decorating the house for Christmas, Mia pulled out a small, old ornament shaped like an angel. She held it up, her eyes filled with wonder. "Did this belong to my mom?" she asked. Alexander felt a lump rise in his throat. The ornament had indeed been Sarah's favorite, one she had insisted on placing on the tree herself every year. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, it did. She loved that angel." Mia's eyes softened, and she looked at the ornament with a newfound reverence before carefully placing it on a low branch. Alexander watched, marveling at how seamlessly she had become a part of his life, her presence filling the empty spaces that had once seemed insurmountable. That night, as he sat alone by the fireplace, watching the glow of the Christmas lights, he thought about how much had changed. He had once resigned himself to a life of quiet solitude, to memories of Sarah that both comforted and haunted him. But now, with Mia here, his world had transformed, filled with laughter, warmth, and a renewed sense of purpose. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt, perhaps for the first time, a sense of peace. The future no longer felt like a distant, bleak expanse. Instead, it felt rich with promise, with the chance to create new memories, ones filled with love and family. And as the house settled into silence, Alexander knew that he had found not only a granddaughter but a second chance. A chance to honor Sarah's memory by giving Mia the life she deserved, surrounded by love and acceptance. This time, he wouldn't let anything slip away. As winter deepened, Alexander and Mia settled comfortably into their life together, each day weaving them closer as a family. Snow blanketed the streets and the trees outside, casting the house in a gentle quietness that felt almost magical. It was Mia's first winter in her new home, and she took to it with the same curiosity and wonder she brought to everything. Alexander would watch her from the window, bundled up in her coat and scarf, attempting to catch snowflakes on her mittened hands, her laughter brightening the gray, wintry mornings. One evening, after a fresh snowfall, Alexander suggested they go for a walk. Mia's eyes sparkled at the idea, and soon they were strolling through the quiet, snow-covered streets. Their breath came in soft puffs as they walked, the crunch of snow beneath their boots the only sound around them. Mia's hand slipped into his, and they continued in comfortable silence, the city lights casting a warm glow on the snow. "Grandpa," Mia said after a while, her voice thoughtful, "do you think my mom used to like the snow?" Alexander smiled down at her, picturing Sarah as a young girl. "Oh, she loved it. She would rush outside the moment the first snowflakes started falling. I couldn't get her back in until she was red-cheeked and shivering," he replied, a faint laugh escaping him. "She used to build the tallest snowmen on our street, and she'd always insist on putting the scarf and hat on last, as if it would bring the snowman to life." Mia's face brightened, her eyes far off as though she were picturing it. "Maybe we can build a snowman like that too?" "I think we absolutely should," Alexander replied, feeling a warm surge of joy at the idea. "And you can decide what goes on last." They returned home, cheeks pink from the cold and hearts full of quiet contentment. That night, Alexander tucked Mia into bed as he always did, reading her a story before turning off the light. But as he stood to leave, she reached out, grabbing his hand. "Grandpa," she began, her voice hesitant, "do you ever feel like someone's still with you, even if you can't see them?" Alexander paused, the question striking something deep within him. He sat back down on the edge of her bed, meeting her gaze. "Yes, Mia," he said softly. "Sometimes I do. I feel like your mom is still with us, watching over you, even if we can't see her." Mia seemed to absorb his words, a small, thoughtful smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I think so too," she whispered, then closed her eyes, holding her pendant as if it were a link to the mother she'd never fully known. Alexander stayed with her a moment longer, feeling a surge of gratitude for this quiet, gentle connection they shared. A few days later, on a particularly bright morning, they ventured outside to build the promised snowman. Mia took charge immediately, her small hands packing the snow into firm, round shapes while Alexander rolled each ball across the yard to make it larger. Together, they shaped a figure almost as tall as Mia, laughing as they worked, their breath fogging up in the cold. When it came time to add the finishing touches, Mia insisted on hunting down the perfect items. She returned from the house carrying one of Alexander's old scarves and a battered hat, grinning as she handed them over. With great care, she wrapped the scarf around the snowman's neck, positioning it just so. Then, after a dramatic pause, she placed the hat on its head. "There," she announced proudly, standing back to admire their work. "Now it's a real snowman." Alexander chuckled, his heart light. "Just like your mom used to do. She'd be proud of this one." They took a moment to admire their creation, standing side by side, the silence between them warm and comforting. But then Mia looked up at him, her expression serious, as though she had something important to say. "Grandpa," she began, her voice tentative, "do you think my mom is happy now? I mean, wherever she is." Alexander knelt down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I think she's very happy, Mia. She'd be so proud of you, of how strong and brave you are." Mia looked down, a shy smile appearing on her face as she nodded, clearly reassured. "I'm glad. I hope she knows that I'm okay now, that I'm with you." Alexander felt a tightness in his throat, his emotions momentarily overwhelming him. He pulled her into a hug, holding her close, feeling the depth of what she had said. "She knows, Mia," he whispered. "She knows you're loved and safe." They spent the rest of the day outside, playing in the snow and enjoying each other's company, both feeling the warmth of family, of a bond that no amount of time or distance could erase. Later, as they sat by the fire in the cozy glow of their living room, Alexander knew that this was everything he had been searching for. A sense of peace, of belonging, of family. That night, as he watched Mia drift off to sleep, he realized just how much she had transformed his life. In every small way, She had reminded him of Sarah, but more importantly, she had given him a new purpose. The love they shared wasn't just a tribute to Sarah's memory. It was a gift, a second chance to live fully, to cherish the moments that made life rich and meaningful. As he closed the door to her room and walked back down the hall, Alexander felt something he hadn't felt in years, a deep, enduring sense of gratitude. The empty, echoing house had become a home once more, filled with laughter, warmth, and the promise of all the days yet to come. And for the first time since Sarah's passing, he felt complete. Winter melted into spring, and the garden outside Alexander's home blossomed with fresh life. Mia settled fully into her new home, her laughter and curiosity filling every corner of the house. For Alexander, each day with her was a gift, a second chance he hadn't thought possible. They had fallen into a rhythm, a quiet, comforting closeness that felt as though it had always been there. One Saturday, after a morning spent planting seeds in the garden, Alexander took Mia into the living room. Sunlight poured in through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the room, and Alexander pulled a dusty box from the back of a tall shelf, setting it carefully on the table in front of her. "What's in there?" Mia asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Alexander smiled, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nostalgia. "Memories," he replied softly, lifting the lid. Inside were pieces of Sarah's childhood, photographs, small trinkets, drawings she had made. The box was a snapshot of a life once filled with laughter, dreams, and wonder. Mia reached inside, pulling out a small, weathered notebook with faded flowers on the cover. She opened it, her eyes widening as she skimmed over the words. "Did my mom write these?" she whispered. "Yes," Alexander said, a warm pride filling his voice. "She used to write little stories, poems, anything that came to her mind. She had such a lively imagination, just like you." They spent the afternoon going through the box, Alexander sharing stories of Sarah's childhood, filling in the gaps of Mia's memories with his own. He showed her pictures of Sarah at Mia's age, smiling at the beach, her hair blowing in the wind, and another with her proudly holding a drawing she'd made. Mia laughed at the stories he told, soaking up every detail. But then, toward the bottom of the box, she pulled out a photograph that was different from the others. It was slightly worn, the edges faded, but it showed Sarah holding a small bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. Mia looked up at Alexander, her expression questioning. "Is this me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Alexander's throat tightened, and he nodded. "Yes, Mia. Your mom loved you very much. She carried this picture everywhere, kept it with her until she couldn't anymore." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know about you then, but I can see now how much she loved you, even if it meant keeping you a secret." Mia looked down at the photograph, her fingers tracing the edges. "She looked so happy," she murmured, almost to herself. "I wish I could remember her better." Alexander felt his heart ache as he reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I know, Mia, but you're a part of her. Every day, in everything you do, you carry a piece of her with you." He paused, meeting her gaze. "And because of you, I get to remember her too." They sat together, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. Finally, Mia slipped the photograph back into the box, closing it gently, almost reverently. In the days that followed, Alexander noticed a change in Mia. She seemed more at peace, her questions quieter, as though she had found a kind of resolution within herself. The sadness that had once filled her eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet resilience that reminded him so much of Sarah. She was thriving, filled with a confidence and joy that warmed his heart. One sunny afternoon, Mia was playing outside when she ran into the house, her face alight with excitement. "Grandpa, I made something for you," she announced, holding a piece of paper behind her back. "Oh." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Well, let's see it then." She beamed, presenting the paper with a flourish. On it was a drawing of their home, surrounded by a garden of colorful flowers, the two of them standing side by side in front. Above them, she had written in careful letters, "Our family." Alexander's breath caught as he took in the drawing, a wave of emotion flooding over him. The simple words carried so much weight, so much meaning. He looked down at Mia, his voice choked with gratitude. "Thank you, Mia," he whispered. "It's beautiful. I'll keep it forever." Mia hugged him, and he held her close, feeling the completeness of their journey, the bond they had formed through both sorrow and joy. This was his family now, his reason to move forward, to fill each day with love and purpose. That evening, as they sat together reading by the fireplace, Alexander felt a profound sense of peace. He had found his way back to family, to the heart of what truly mattered. Mia had brought new life, new meaning to his days, and through her, he had found a way to remember and honor Sarah. In a quiet moment, Mia looked up at him, her voice soft. "Are you happy, Grandpa?" He smiled, his eyes misting as he nodded. "Yes, Mia, happier than I ever thought I could be." And as they sat together, the room filled with warmth. Alexander knew that their story was just beginning. Together, they had found love, healing, and a place to call home, a place where they both belonged.